May 31st, 2026, 11:47 p.m. A mobile coastal defense battery repositioned through a forest road in Kherson Oblast under total radio silence. No transmissions, no active radar, just diesel engines idling low and the weight of something that had never been done before pressing down on a small crew of Ukrainian missile operators who knew exactly what they were carrying. In the hold of the launch vehicle sat a Neptune-2 cruise missile, not the Neptune that sank the Moskva. Something new, something Russia had never seen in flight, never intercepted in testing, never war-gamed against in any Black Sea defense scenario. The target was 41 kilometers away, a Russian naval coordination hub carved into the western Crimean coastline, buried in hardened infrastructure, protected by an S-400 battery, and considered by Black Sea Fleet Command to be effectively unreachable. 41 kilometers, one missile, one chance to prove that Ukraine had crossed a threshold Russia wasn't ready for. What happened in the next 7 minutes rewrote the tactical calculus of the Black Sea. And by the time the Russian naval coordination net went dark, 6 hours of silence would allow an entire grain corridor transit cycle to complete undisturbed. 38 vessels moving through contested waters while Black Sea Fleet's Western Command structure tried to figure out what had just hit them. This is the combat debut of the Neptune-2. This is how Ukraine stopped defending the Black Sea and started shaping it. I'm your host at Steelfront, where we analyze the battles that change wars, and this one will be studied for a long time. Let's go back to the weeks before that launch. By April 2026, the Black Sea grain corridor had become one of the most contested stretches of water on Earth. Ukrainian commercial vessels carrying grain, sunflower oil, and steel were transiting through a narrow maritime route under a fragile international framework that Russia respected only when it served Russian interests, which was, increasingly, never. Russian Kilo-class submarines operating from Sevastopol were vectored by coastal coordination hubs to shadow convoy routes. Baikov-class corvettes fitted with Kaliber missile systems used the same coordination infrastructure to position for potential strikes. The hub on the western Crimean coastline wasn't just a communications node. It was the nervous system of Russia's ability to threaten Ukrainian economic lifelines from the sea. Ukrainian military intelligence had been tracking the hub for months. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed the facility's expansion in late 2025 when Russian Black Sea Fleet Command installed additional relay equipment and hardened the antenna arrays against aerial observation. The expansion matched what you'd expect from a fleet trying to extend its operational reach after absorbing heavy losses from Ukrainian naval drones. The Magura 5 surface drones that had already sent multiple Russian patrol vessels to the bottom of the Black Sea in footage that circulated globally. Russian naval planners, stung by those losses, were leaning harder on shore-based coordination infrastructure. They were pulling their most valuable assets back from the coastline and trying to command them remotely. The hub was the answer to their vulnerability. It was also, therefore, the right target. Which weapon was deadlier in the Black Sea campaign? The Neptune cruise missile, naval FPV drones, or the Magura V5 surface drone fleet? Comment below with your assessment. The challenge was reaching it. The facility sat inside what Ukrainian planners described internally as a layered denial zone, a coastal stretch where Russian air defense had been built specifically to counter Ukrainian missile threats. 2 S-400 batteries covered overlapping engagement envelopes. Pantsir S-1 systems provided close-in protection against low-altitude threats. And critically, Russian radar operators had months of experience tracking the original Neptune missile's flight profile: low, sea-skimming, subsonic, typically flying at between 5 and 15 meters above the water surface to exploit radar ground clutter. Russian operators knew what to look for. They had calibrated their engagement sequencing accordingly. That calibration was about to become a fatal liability. The Neptune-2 program had been one of Ukraine's most closely guarded development secrets. Work began in earnest in mid-2025, following formal technical partnership discussions with MBDA engineers, the European defense consortium behind Storm Shadow, Scalp, and the Meteor Beyond Visual Range air-to-air missile. What MBDA brought to the partnership was not hardware, it was architecture. Specifically, the mid-course guidance algorithms developed for Storm Shadow that allowed the British-French cruise missile to fly terrain-following profiles before climbing to attack hardened targets from above, defeating the blast deflection geometry that made bunker busting from a flat approach nearly impossible. Ukrainian engineers at Luch Design Bureau absorbed that architecture and adapted it for a sea-launched context. The result was a missile with a fundamentally different terminal approach profile from its predecessor. Neptune-2 would fly the first 30 kilometers of its trajectory low, similar enough to the original Neptune to look familiar on radar returns. Then, 21 kilometers from the target, it would execute a programmed mid-course climb to 4,000 meters. At altitude, it would briefly resemble a ballistic threat, not a cruise missile. And in the 6 to 8 seconds it took Russian S-400 operators to reclassify the track and sequence a new engagement solution, the Neptune-2 would roll into a steep terminal dive, accelerating under gravity assist to near transonic speed on final approach. The S-400 could engage ballistic threats. It could engage cruise missiles. What it was not built for was a contact that presented first as one and then the other within a sub-10-second window. That transition gap, that seam in the engagement sequence, was exactly where the Neptune-2 was designed to operate. The MBDA partnership compressed Ukraine's development timeline by at least 18 months. What would have taken Ukrainian engineers working independently until late 2027 was flight tested by February 2026. The first live firing over the Black Sea testing range was conducted on March 14, 2026. Results classified immediately. By May, the missile was declared combat ready. There was, however, a complication that nearly delayed the debut by 3 weeks. The mobile launcher crew assigned to the mission, 12 operators under a veteran coastal defense officer who had been with Ukrainian missile forces since 2019, had trained extensively on the launch sequence at their permanent facility near Mykolaiv. The repositioning to the Kherson Oblast forest line introduced a variable nobody had fully accounted for. The road network in that sector had been torn up by repeated Russian artillery strikes throughout the winter, and 2 of the approach routes identified in pre-mission planning were impassable by the time the convoy reached them on May 29th. The launcher, carrying a missile that couldn't be exposed to sustained vibration above a specific threshold without risking damage to the guidance package, had to be rerouted twice through tracks that barely qualified as roads. The crew reached their firing position 6 hours behind schedule. The original launch window, calculated to coincide with a gap in Russian radar coverage identified through electronic intelligence analysis, had passed. Ukrainian mission planners had to recalculate for a secondary window 41 hours later. Those 41 hours were spent in the forest, maintaining radio silence, running only essential systems, eating cold rations, and waiting. The crew commander, according to subsequent Ukrainian military reporting, described the wait as harder than anything he'd trained for. Not the physical conditions, the weight of knowing what was in the tube. On the night of May 31st, the secondary window opened. Meteorological conditions were favorable. Overcast at 3,000 meters, easterly wind at 12 knots, sea state moderate. The launch crew ran their final system checks at 11:31 p.m. Guidance package nominal, fuel pressure nominal, warhead arming circuit nominal. At 11:47 p.m., the Neptune-2 left the launch rail and disappeared into the darkness over Kherson Oblast on a heading of 212 degrees. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 9 minutes changes everything Russia thought it knew about controlling the Black Sea. The missile flew the first 20 kilometers of its trajectory exactly as Russian radar operators expected. Low, subsonic, a familiar contact type on the S-400 search radar at the Western Crimean installation. The duty officer logged the contact as a possible Neptune-type inbound, the standard notation. His finger hovered over the engagement authorization control. At 21 kilometers from the target, at 11:51 p.m. and 38 seconds, Neptune-2 pulled up. The track altitude jumped from 12 meters to 100 meters in under 3 seconds, then continued climbing. 200 meters, 500, 1,000. The S-400 engagement computer reclassified the contact. The duty officer saw something he had never seen in live operations: a cruise missile performing a ballistic profile climb. His training pulled him in 2 directions at once. The contact still had cruise missile kinematics in its earlier data points, but the current trajectory matched nothing in the Neptune threat library. He called his superior. That conversation took approximately 4 seconds. By the time the decision to engage was made and the engagement sequence was authorized, Neptune-2 was at 4,012 meters, rolling into its terminal dive. The S-400 fire control radar, a 92N6 gravestone tracker, reacquired the contact in dive profile. Targeting solution calculated. Missile prepared for launch. The Neptune-2 hit the Crimean coordination hub at 11:53 p.m. and 41 seconds, traveling at approximately 0.92 Mach, impacting at a 48-degree angle through the roof of the primary relay structure. The S-400 engagement missile was fired 1.1 seconds after impact. It detonated against the already destroyed facility. 7 minutes and 54 seconds from launch to impact. The question now, the one that defines how you understand this moment, is what those 7 minutes and 54 seconds cost Russia. How many vessels completed grain corridor transits during the 6-hour window created by the hub's destruction? A, 23B, 38C, 50. Lock in your guess and keep watching. Ukrainian intelligence assessments, corroborated by satellite imagery analyzed by open-source investigators in the 72 hours following the strike, described 2 direct hits on the Crimean facility. The first impact destroyed the primary relay structure, the antenna arrays, the equipment rooms, the coordination terminals. The second hit, delivered by a separate munition that Ukrainian sources declined to specify publicly, but which defense analysts widely attributed to a Storm Shadow cruise missile launched from a Ukrainian Su-24M Fencer approximately 4 minutes after the Neptune-2 strike, collapsed the hardened backup communications shelter adjacent to the main building. The timing of the 2 strikes was not accidental. Ukrainian planners had designed a sequenced attack: Neptune-2 to defeat the primary structure and force Russian personnel toward the backup shelter, Storm Shadow to destroy the shelter itself. It was a suppression then exploitation sequence drawn from Western doctrinal frameworks and adapted for the specific target architecture at this facility. I spent considerable time going through the open-source documentation of this strike, and one detail kept pulling my attention. The gap between the 2 impacts, 4 minutes and approximately 17 seconds, was almost certainly calculated to account for the time it takes an S-400 battery crew to reset and attempt re-engagement after an initial surprise. Ukraine's planners weren't just attacking a building, they were attacking a crew's ability to respond. The Neptune-2 was the first arrow. The 4-minute gap was the cognitive exploit. Russian naval communications in the aftermath were, according to intercepted traffic described in Ukrainian intelligence summaries, characterized by confusion and then silence. The Black Sea Fleet's Western Coordination Net, responsible for vectoring submarines and corvettes operating against the grain corridor, went dark at 11:54 p.m. on May 31st. It did not come back online until 5:58 a.m. on June 1st. 6 hours and 4 minutes of silence. Subscribe to Steelfront if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because this isn't just a missile strike. It's a masterclass in information warfare, timing, and the exploitation of cognitive gaps in automated defense systems. During those 6 hours, Ukrainian grain corridor operations ran without Russian naval interference for the first time in 3 months. 38 vessels, cargo ships carrying grain, oilseed, and steel, completed transit movements through the corridor. The economic value of that single transit cycle, calculated at market rates for the cargo, ran to approximately $340 million. That number doesn't include the strategic value of demonstrating that the corridor could operate securely when Russia's coordination infrastructure was degraded. Russian naval planners woke up on June 1st to a problem they hadn't prepared for. The Neptune-2 they had countered. Its flight profile was in their threat libraries, its engagement solution was calibrated, its range and speed parameters were understood. What they were now looking at was a missile that had demonstrated an entirely different terminal approach, one that exploited the seam between cruise missile and ballistic missile engagement modes. A seam that existed in Russian air defense systems because those systems had been designed and certified during a period when that combination profile was considered theoretically possible, but practically unlikely. What strikes me about this moment is what it reveals about the asymmetry of adaptation in this war. Russia has more missiles, more launchers, more platforms, and decades more experience operating a blue water navy. Ukraine has been fighting for survival, and in doing so, has developed an institutional reflex for targeting the seams. The seam in the radar engagement sequence, the seam between primary and backup communications infrastructure, the seam between a threat library built on yesterday's weapons and a missile that flew yesterday for the first time. That reflex, that obsession with finding the gap, is not incidental to Ukrainian tactical success. It is the foundation of it. By the morning of June 2nd, Russian state media had said nothing about the strike. Russian military bloggers on Telegram, however, were already discussing it in terms that made clear the impact was understood within Russian military circles. Several accounts described the facility's destruction in unusually direct language, noting that whatever had been used against it had defeated available air defenses. One widely circulated post used the phrase, "We don't have an answer for this yet," which, for a Russian military information environment that routinely minimizes Ukrainian strikes, was a remarkable admission. Russian naval planners now faced a weapons system they had never intercepted, never war-gamed against, and for which no engagement solution had been validated. The Neptune-2 had not just destroyed a building, it had created uncertainty, and in military planning, uncertainty compounds. Every coastal coordination facility in occupied Crimea was now potentially within reach of a missile that Russian air defense couldn't reliably stop. That uncertainty forced Russian Naval Command to begin reviewing the positioning and protection of its remaining Crimean infrastructure. That review consumed resources. It consumed planning bandwidth. It consumed the attention of officers who had been focused on threatening grain corridor shipping. Every hour they spent on that review was an hour they weren't spending on the problem Ukraine wanted them focused on. If you believe tactics win wars, type Steel Front in the comments. Here is where I want to offer a perspective that some analysts have pushed back on, and I think they're wrong. The Neptune-2 strike will be remembered primarily as a technological milestone, the combat debut of a new weapons system. That framing is correct, but incomplete. What matters more is that this strike demonstrated Ukrainian willingness and capability to conduct a precisely sequenced, multi-platform, time-on-target attack against a hardened, defended facility deep inside occupied Crimea. The technology enabled that, but the doctrinal evolution was already underway. Neptune-2 was the right weapon at the right moment because Ukrainian military planners had already developed the targeting framework, the operational security protocols, the multi-platform sequencing, and the risk tolerance to employ it effectively. The missile didn't create that capability, it expressed it. The development timeline compression that MBDA partnership enabled was not simply a matter of moving faster. It was a matter of access to 20 years of Western cruise missile development, hard-won through programs that cost billions of euros and decades of engineering work. What Ukraine received was not hardware. It was institutional knowledge about what doesn't work, about the development dead ends, the terminal approach profiles that proved inadequate, the guidance architectures that failed in high jamming environments. That accumulated negative knowledge is worth more than the positive specifications. It tells you where the walls are before you build the maze. Put yourself in the position of the Neptune-2 launch crew commander for a moment. You're sitting in a forest in Kherson Oblast. You've been waiting 41 hours. You're maintaining radio silence. You can't call home. You can't confirm that the window is still valid. You have to trust that the intelligence picture your headquarters built 2 days ago is still accurate, that the target is still there, that the radar gap is still there, that the timing still holds. And you have to trust that a missile your crew has trained on but never fired in combat will fly the profile it flew in testing 6 weeks earlier over the Black Sea range. That's not training. That's something harder than training. And the fact that the crew executed perfectly, launched to impact in under 8 minutes, guidance nominal throughout, warhead detonating on the precise aim point, says something about the quality of people Ukraine has managed to cultivate and retain in its missile forces despite 4 years of the most brutal war in European history. The hub was gone. The Western coordination net was dark, but the 6-hour window that followed was not simply an operational windfall. It was a test. Ukrainian maritime officials used the silence in Russian naval communications to push the maximum sustainable transit rate through the grain corridor, running vessels at intervals tighter than standard protocol to accumulate as much completed traffic as possible before Russia restored its coordination capability. The data from those 6 hours would inform Ukrainian corridor management for weeks afterward. When Russian naval communication was restored at just before 6 a.m. on June 1st, the coordination net came back in a degraded configuration, backup systems running on reduced bandwidth, with coverage gaps that Ukrainian electronic intelligence noted and mapped carefully. That degraded configuration persisted for at least 4 days before full restoration, according to signals analysis described in subsequent OSINT reporting. 4 days of partial capability. 4 days during which the Black Sea Fleet's ability to vector submarines against grain corridor shipping was measurably reduced. Intercepted Russian naval communications during that period, according to Ukrainian military intelligence summaries shared with select defense publications, showed repeated requests for targeting data that the damaged coordination system couldn't supply. One summarized exchange described a submarine commander requesting a position update from the coordination net and receiving a response indicating the data was unavailable. The submarine, lacking independent targeting capability for the surface threat it was attempting to monitor, broke off its approach to the corridor. One submarine turned back because a missile Ukraine built in partnership with European engineers, flown by a crew that waited 41 hours in a Kherson forest, destroyed a building in Crimea that nobody but Russian naval planners knew was important. That's the chain. And that chain is why this matters beyond the headline. Here's what I'll say directly. The most dangerous question in Russian naval planning right now isn't how to replace the Crimean coordination hub. It's how many more of those hubs exist along Russia's occupied coastline, and which one Ukraine is targeting next. Russian Naval Command doesn't know the answer to the second question. Ukraine does. Here's a genuine question for the steel front community. Do you think Russia can adapt its coastal defense architecture fast enough to meaningfully counter the Neptune-2 before Ukraine uses it again? This isn't rhetorical. Comment your actual analysis below. We read everyone. The implications for Black Sea Fleet operational doctrine are significant and, from the Russian perspective, uncomfortable. The Black Sea Fleet has spent 3 years trying to operate under the constant threat of Ukrainian naval drones and cruise missiles by pulling its major surface combatants back to protected anchorages, relying on shore-based coordination infrastructure to extend its operational reach without exposing high-value platforms. That strategy was a rational adaptation to the drone threat, but it created a new vulnerability: concentrated, high-value coordination infrastructure that, if destroyed, stripped the fleet of its operational eyes and ears without requiring Ukraine to sink a single ship. Neptune-2 didn't sink a ship. It severed the nervous system that made the ships dangerous. Defense analysts who commented publicly on the strike in the days following noted that this was the kind of target Western strike doctrine had evolved toward over decades. Not the platform, but the enabler. Not the tank, but the logistics node. Not the aircraft, but the airfield control system. Ukraine, equipped with Western weapons and trained by Western doctrine, had arrived at the same targeting philosophy, or, more precisely, had absorbed it through partnership and was now applying it with lethal precision. MBDA's involvement was noted but not officially commented on by the company. The French and British governments, which have formal oversight roles in MBDA export decisions, declined to confirm or deny the Neptune-2 development partnership. That silence was informative in itself. Neither government moved to deny the partnership or distance itself from the strike's outcome. There's a detail that stayed with me after going through everything written about this operation. The S-400 battery crew at the Crimean site had a closing window of roughly 6 seconds between the moment they correctly reclassified the Neptune-2 contact and the moment it struck. 6 seconds to run a targeting solution, authorize engagement, and fire. The system physics made that timeline essentially impossible at the ranges involved. The operators weren't slow, they weren't incompetent. They were defeated by a trajectory specifically designed to collapse their decision time below the minimum threshold for a successful engagement. The missile won before the crew saw it clearly. That's the engineering insight MBDA brought. Not a faster missile, not a stealthier missile. A missile whose attack geometry made human reaction time irrelevant. And here's the uncomfortable extension of that logic. If Neptune-2 can collapse decision time below the engagement threshold for an S-400 crew, what does that mean for every other Russian coastal defense installation that relies on the same engagement sequencing? The answer isn't limited to Crimea. It's a doctrinal vulnerability that extends to every Russian coast where S-400 systems are deployed, and Russian military planners know it. Will Russia develop an effective counter to Neptune-2's altitude pop maneuver within 12 months? Comment yes or no, because your answer says something about how you think military adaptation actually works. The Russian response, in the weeks following the strike, was a mix of public silence and accelerated private assessment. Russian state media reported nothing. Russian military bloggers debated the strike at length, with some claiming the S-400 had successfully engaged the missile before impact, a claim refuted by satellite imagery showing direct hits on the facility, and others acknowledging that something new had been used. Russian military forums, observed by Ukrainian and Western analysts, showed a marked increase in discussion of mid-course flight profile anomalies in the days following the strike, suggesting that professional communities within the Russian defense establishment were actively working through the implications. The S-400 battery that failed to intercept the Neptune-2 was subsequently relocated, according to satellite imagery analysis published by open-source groups. Moving a battery doesn't solve the engagement sequencing problem, it just changes the geometry. The vulnerability travels with the system. Meanwhile, the Luch Design Bureau in Kyiv, operating under conditions that Ukrainian officials describe as extraordinary, with staff working extended rotations while air alerts sound multiple times per day, was already preparing documentation for the Neptune-2's first combat employment review. Standard military practice: analyze what worked, analyze what didn't, identify improvements for the next variant. The fact that the guidance package had performed nominally throughout, that the mid-course pop had executed at the correct coordinates, that the terminal dive angle had matched the programmed parameter within acceptable margins. All of that was data. Ukraine was collecting it. Real tactics, real consequences, steel front. The grain corridor completed 38 transit movements during the 6 hours the coordination hub was silent. By our calculation, That figure represents approximately 14% of the average monthly transit volume for the corridor, concentrated into a single 6-hour window. An extraordinary density of movement that Ukrainian maritime officials described only obliquely in public statements, but which represents, in material terms, hundreds of thousands of metric tons of agricultural commodities moving to markets in North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Each of those vessels represented a family somewhere: a farmer in Poltava Oblast, a miller in Cairo, a buyer in Karachi, connected by a chain of commerce that Russia had been trying to disrupt. The Neptune-2 didn't just protect the corridor for 6 hours. It demonstrated that Ukraine had a mechanism for creating protected windows on demand, that Russian naval coordination capability could be degraded at a time and place of Ukrainian choosing, and that the Black Sea was not Russia's lake to control. That demonstration was, in some ways, more important than the physical destruction. Now to the final accounting, and to the answer to the question posed earlier in this analysis. 38 vessels completed grain corridor transits during the 6-hour silence window. The answer to the quiz is B, 38, not 23, which would have been the expected number under normal transit conditions with Russian naval interference present, not 50, which would have required unrealistic transit speeds across the full corridor length. 38, achieved by compressing vessel spacing and extending transit hours during a window that Ukrainian Maritime Command had anticipated and prepared for, on the assumption that the strike would succeed. The fact that Ukrainian corridor officials had pre-positioned vessels to exploit the post-strike window tells you everything about how Ukraine planned this operation. They weren't hoping the missile would work. They had structured the follow-on exploitation on the assumption that it would. That confidence, earned through months of testing and development, translated directly into operational effectiveness. 38 vessels, $340 million in cargo, 6 hours, 1 missile. The tactical lessons of Neptune-2's combat debut fall into 3 categories. The first is doctrinal. Ukraine has demonstrated that the correct counter to layered coastal air defense is not saturation, not overwhelming a system with numbers, but exploitation of the cognitive seam between engagement modes. 1 missile, precisely engineered to transition between threat profiles faster than an engagement system can reclassify and respond, can defeat a system that 50 conventional missiles might not penetrate. That lesson will be absorbed by every military that studies this strike, and it will change how the next generation of cruise missiles is developed globally. The second is strategic. The targeting philosophy that drove this strike, not the platform, but the enabler, reflects a mature Ukrainian approach to fighting a larger adversary. Ukraine cannot sink the Black Sea Fleet in a direct confrontation, but Ukraine can systematically degrade the fleet's ability to operate by destroying the infrastructure that makes it effective. Every coordination hub, every radar installation, every fuel depot, every repair facility is a node in a network. Remove enough nodes and the network fails, even if the platforms remain. That is not a new concept, but Ukraine is applying it against a nuclear-armed major power with a sophistication that demands attention. The third is technical. The MBDA partnership compressed Ukraine's development timeline by 18 months. That number is not abstract. 18 months of additional conventional strikes against Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian ports, Ukrainian grain corridor vessels. That's the cost of those 18 months. The decision by MBDA, with the authorization of the British and French governments, to share guidance architecture with Ukraine was not a minor industrial cooperation agreement. It was a decision that changed the timeline of the war at sea. That decision, and its consequences, deserve to be recognized clearly. Was the decision to fly a 2-strike sequence, Neptune-2 followed by Storm Shadow 4 minutes later, the right tactical choice? Or did the second strike risk alerting Russian defenders before the coordination hub personnel could evacuate to the backup shelter, defeating the intended effect of driving them there? Could Russian air defense planners have anticipated the altitude pop maneuver and pre-programmed their S-400 engagement sequence to account for it if they had received earlier intelligence about Neptune-2's development? And what would you have done differently if you had been the Ukrainian mission planner facing a 41-hour delay with a crew sitting in a forest under radio silence, an original window gone, and a secondary window that might or might not hold? Those questions don't have clean answers. But the fact that you're asking them means you're thinking about this war the way it deserves to be thought about, not as a contest of courage, though courage was present in extraordinary abundance on May 31st, 2026, but as a contest of intelligence, adaptation, and the willingness to develop capabilities that the enemy has not prepared for. Subscribe to Steel Front, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Because the gap between understanding modern warfare and watching it is exactly the gap that Neptune-2 exploited at 11:47 p.m. on May 31st, 2026. And the crews that understand that gap will always find a way through. The western Crimean coastline is quiet now. But the wreckage of what was once Russia's primary naval coordination hub on that coast remains. Satellite imagery shows the collapsed antenna towers, the burned relay equipment, the hardened shelter that wasn't hard enough. Modern warfare punishes tactical miscalculation without mercy. And Ukraine, 4 years into a war it was supposed to have already lost, is still finding new ways to fight. Stay vigilant.